Welcome to Vineyard Church Dungannon, where we're walking together deeper into faith. The following message was given at one of our Sunday gatherings. For more information, visit vineyarddungannon.co.uk.
So it's actually quite interesting just to sing birthdays just before we come up, because one of the things that we're looking at today to a large extent is I suppose the passage of time. And I was sort of wondering, who might volunteer themselves as a young adult, and I sort of got the impression that Cheryl might have as well, even though Cheryl is similar vintage to myself. But you know what? I was watching TV last night, and one of the things that actually struck me of the passage of time was that there was a program on to celebrate Rick Astley's 60th birthday. Now, some of the young people here have no idea what I'm talking about. And there's interesting things like the Rick Astley paradox and things, but we'll talk about that at another time. But the passage of time is something that we're going to consider quite a bit in I suppose, the book of Daniel that we're going to look at. It's essentially God's constancy, God's sovereignty, as nations rise and fall, as people live their lives out and pass on. And God the constant, God the provider, God who's in charge, God who loves. And one of the things we really, really want to do as we study the book of Daniel is to understand just who God is and how important he is. Sharon gave the SLT a book to read. It's called sort of Gradually, Then Suddenly, talking about the importance of faithfulness, and we'll certainly see that in the life of Daniel. Small habits, actually what Ruth talked about last night, healthy habits, last week, healthy habits that build into a life of service, and at times those small things add up into very, very big things. But I just want to read you a wee section from this book, Gradually Then Suddenly. It says, do we need a vision from God? No doubt. Without a vision, the people perish. But even more than a vision from God, we need a vision of God. A vision of God high and exalted. A low view of God is the cause of 100 lesser evils. But a high view of God is the solution to 10,000 temporal problems. We are called to be supernatural revolutionaries. Or solutionaries, they call it here. I'm not sure that's an English word, but we know what they mean by that. We're bringing the supernatural. We're called to be supernatural solutionaries, but it starts by getting in sync with God's word and with God's spirit. And as we study the book of Daniel, the one thing that comes across time and time is the importance of that relationship with God. And it's actually the God part of that, rather than the person part of that, that is just so important. So please, as we study the book of Daniel, bear that in mind. It's such an exciting book. It's a strange book in many ways, but it's got so many lessons for us. And so we're going to take a little bit of a look at it now. This is an introduction. Sorry, this is probably a little bit more of a sort of history lesson than a sermon, but Ali's got the responsibility for next week. He's really starting Daniel. But it is important, to put the book of Daniel into context, because there's so much for us to learn in it. So we've called the series Naturally Supernatural. In other words, we live in the power of the Spirit. We want to encourage each one of ourselves to live as if we really believe that. Somebody's tried to live in a very rational way, and actually, there's nothing rational about our God. He is supernatural, he is powerful, and we're called to live in the light of that. And we have the ability to unlock that supernatural, God bringing power through us. And that's one of the really key things we want us to remember. So, a few things about Daniel. Hopefully this is working, and we shall see how it goes. See what that's, yes, that's it. So, we're doing a little bit of an introduction, firstly, to the book. Now, this is actually, the scroll you see up there was actually a copy of the manuscript of Daniel found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's a very, very old book, very revered book by the Jews. And obviously it was copied time and time again so that people could read it. It covers the period 605 BC to 536. So always sort of that counting down. So the smaller the number, the closer it is to us. And it identifies the prophet Daniel as its author. So Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Not a big surprise. That was confirmed by Jesus in the New Testament, and he also mentions Daniel as the author of it. So just very quickly then, the structure of Daniel, it's such an interesting book because the first half of it is essentially focused on tales of the royal court. You know, we've heard of stories like that there before, but the whole sort of Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel the vegetarian, you know, the three friends in the fiery furnace, all of that is in the first half of Daniel. It's really telling a history lesson of what happened. And as we look at that, we can see how God intervened in that period. The second half of the book, chapter 7 to 12, is going to be the really interesting book, and that's where we're bringing in one or two of the pastors. Okay. Smooth as silk, as they say. So we're basically saying there that chapter 7 to 12 are quite complex, and we're bringing in one or two people with experts in theological training to talk about one or two of those chapters, because they're actually quite complex, but actually they very much talk to us about God's sovereignty, both in history, in the now, and in the future. And that's why Daniel is such an encouraging book as well. Just on top of that as well, the book is actually written in two languages, which is really interesting. The first two chapters, or at least as far as up to, there we go, as far as up to chapter, or verse 3 of chapter 2, it's written in Hebrew. Why was it written in Hebrew? Because it was written to the Jews. It was primarily focused on them as Daniel was taken out and moved out of Judah and moved to Babylon. And there was a message there for the Jewish people. The middle bit from about chapter 2, verse 4 through to chapter 7 is written in Aramaic. That was an international trading language that many different nations understood. And there's quite a focus there in that part of the book on messages for the nations. And then it reverts back then around about chapter 8, because it's then talking about God's sovereignty in history again, and it's dealing with the Jews, the restoration of the Jews, and then end times. And so it reverts back into the Hebrew again there. So even in the languages that it's written, there are subtleties that are hidden there. So we're going to read essentially Daniel chapter 1, and it says this. Through to verse 7. So this is basically the structure. This is what happened that actually opens up the book of Daniel. So in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and I put in that's the year 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And he took a while to besiege it, but the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And this has implications later on for Belteshazzar, who takes this stuff out to drink and feast, and later on gets punished for that. But then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and some of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. So what had happened there, Nebuchadnezzar arrived in 605. He essentially besieged the city. He took people away, but he left King Jehoiakim there for another 3 years till Jehoiakim rebelled. And then later on, he took more, and then he came back eventually, and he destroyed the city of Judah. But coming back to the second part of this, then he says he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. In other words, we're bringing these people out of Judah, and we're going to turn them into Babylonians, essentially. We're going to force them to forget their culture and their gods, and we're going to bring them in, and we're going to make them take our culture and our gods. And in that way, they were trying then to maintain a large empire, owning many other countries, because actually some of the people that they brought back from those countries became the rulers. So it was kind of an interesting sort of political strategy, and was quite effective. But essentially then the king appointed them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and he appointed them that they should be educated for 3 years. So it's a university essentially, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. And now among them were the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and those last three are the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were in the fiery furnace. And their names were changed, as was Daniel's actually, but for some reason we know Daniel by his name, and then we know the other one by the Babylonian names. But then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. Actually, it said that. I forgot it left that in. And to Daniel, he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So they were very much trying to turn them into Babylonians. And this was the context in which Daniel lived. And it's actually why it's important for us, because it's actually very like us in a way. We are Christians. We are called to live Christian lives. And sometimes in a country, in a region, in a workplace that's not particularly Christian. And one of the really interesting things about Daniel is how these guys stood out. They remained faithful to their God and to our God, and they stood out. And they just worked and worked and worked at that faithfully. And that's a really clear message and lesson for us. So a few pictures. Hopefully this is coming. So this is the context of Daniel. Essentially the context of the book of Daniel is the destruction and exile of Judah. In fact, it was the exile happened first and the destruction happened in the third one. And it followed ongoing warnings for years and years and years and years and years to the Israelites about, you're walking away from God. You're walking away from God. Come back. And essentially one of the things that God really condemned them for was injustice in society. The rich were living it up, and the poor were absolutely in destitution. There was unfairness, and there was just complete ignorance. And ignorance, not even, that implies there was unawareness. They were aware, they just didn't care of what God had said. And it ended up with this. Daniel was a contemporary of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was about 15 years older than him. Ezekiel was taken out of Judah about 3 years after Daniel. The thing was, Daniel was sent to the royal court, and Ezekiel was sent to be a slave, sort of digging water holes and things like that, and he was a prophet there. Jeremiah also overlapped. Jeremiah was quite a bit older, but he was warning, is that you turn, and they continue just to ignore God. So ultimately God had warned, this is what will happen. There will be an exile, and it will purify you, and you will come back, and you will serve me again. And this is what happened. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar came up against Judah, and he took it. And this is a lovely painting that sort of gives a bit of an idea of what it actually looked like. Then the exile, you can sort of imagine there were 3 or 4 different exiles. There were 3 main exiles, and people had to walk hundreds and hundreds of miles to go where they were going, and they were essentially prisoners. And as I say, Daniel went in the first one, which is 605, and then I think Ezekiel went in 602, and then there were other ones that followed that as well. But you can imagine the pain and the misery as your city's damaged. At the end point, it's actually burning and destroyed, but you're being dragged away from home. And most of these exiles never saw home again. So it was a difficult context. Daniel didn't have it easy. And we've already talked about this, but to say Judah was forced into servitude 605, Daniel went then. There was another exile, a little exile in 602 where some others were taken, but many, many more in 597. And eventually they come back and they destroyed Judah and Jerusalem in 586. So it was an ongoing sort of oppression. So Daniel, the book, is really interesting because we've got a lot of people in it. And we've got Daniel, obviously. You've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know about them. And they're, I suppose, on the side of the good. Nebuchadnezzar is somewhere in the middle because he was a horrible tyrant. And yet, God worked in his life and actually transformed him. You had King Darius and then King Cyrus who let them come back. There's a bit of debate over whether Darius and Cyrus are actually the same person or not. They use different names and things like that there. You know, one king could have 3 or 4 different names. But nonetheless, we're treating them as separate people in this one anyway. But just to give you a wee bit of an outline. So, Daniel, how old do you reckon he was when he came, when he was taken? Any ideas? Going to have a guess. Come on, Tony, take a guess there. 16, yeah, 16. He was about 16. So, our home group is not allowed to answer this. What age was he when he was in the den of lions? 35. You're a bit off. You're getting closer. He was about, I reckon he was sort of in his mid-80s. He might have been 84, he might have been 86. So this is a lifetime of service. We tend to look at these books and everyone's telescoped, and Daniel had such an exciting life. He was off doing this and he was doing that. But most of the time he was just serving faithfully. And this was over an 80-year period. But actually Daniel was well born, as they would say. He was a member of the aristocracy. He was clearly handsome. He was young. He had no defects. But he had aptitude for learning. These were bright guys. and they were brought to try and serve the king of Babylon. But Daniel was marked out because he and his friends as well, they loved God very, very deeply, and that showed in their actions. Now, we haven't dealt with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because the story for them is pretty much the same as for Daniel. But then you've Nebuchadnezzar, who was a tyrant and a megalomaniac, perhaps the likes of which we've never seen. That may or may not be true. Stalin probably ran him close. But he really had the power of life and death, and he was unhinged. There is no, as you read the biblical text, you can see the man is unhinged. And one minute, he's putting glories on people, the next he's murdering them. And he is one of, what would you say, he has a high opinion of himself. He's perhaps one of the proudest men you could ever meet. And ultimately, God deals with that pride. And God challenges him, and God brings him low, and then God raises him up again. But it's really interesting just to see that even the biggest tyrant, or one of the biggest tyrants in history, God has him in his pocket. He can just stop any of the nonsense straight away and just intervene, which is an interesting message for us at the minute when the world does look uncertain and challenging. Our God has it. That's the one thing you can really take from Daniel in that there. You see the rise and fall of kingdoms. But God's always there, and God's predicting the rise and fall of kingdoms later in Daniel, which we saw as well. Then you've Belteshazzar, who was another interesting guy. He probably wasn't an absolute king. He was ruling for somebody else. But nonetheless, he lived well, and he did not care one hoot about God or anybody else. And essentially, we talked earlier on about the goblets and all that came out of the temple, and Belteshazzar knew what those were, but he brought them in so he could essentially drink and feast and have an orgy with those things. And he is the guy that was sitting there when the writing started on the wall, and he was filled with terror. And the words were, "You've sort of many tickle of power." So in other words, God has weighed you in the scales. He's found you wanting, and he's put an end to your kingdom. And that night, he was killed. And then King Darius took over. But again, another tyrant. But God was in control and took him down. Then you've got Darius. Now, I like this picture. This is not Darius. This is Daniel standing casually at 85 years old in the lion's den. I kind of liked it because there's lions in here. I'm standing in the power of my God. He was completely relaxed. Now, I'm not saying that's a photograph, and I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but you get the message, don't you? That I am confident in my God. I don't need to worry. I don't even need to look at the lions, and the lions are staying well away. But Darius succeeded Belteshazzar as king, and he really depended on Daniel, and I find that was really interesting, that actually Nebuchadnezzar depended on Daniel. Belteshazzar didn't. Belteshazzar had him on the edges because he probably didn't like the power and authority that Daniel carried. But as soon as Cyrus came back again, Darius was back in there, Daniel was straight up there again. Darius was really interesting, man, because he appeared at times to be weak. I mean, he didn't really think things through very much, and he was a bit vain, and people come to him and said, "Oh, king, live forever, let everybody pray to you," and all the rest of that there. And he was weak enough that actually let that happen. He wasn't particularly politically savvy by the looks of it. But nonetheless, what we do see is that Darius actually acknowledged God. He was still a pagan king, but he did, through Daniel and Daniel's witness, recognize God and make pronouncements about that. And the lion's den did definitely help on that. This is Cyrus. He's a bit of a fierce-looking man, I think. It's not a photograph, by the way. It's an imaginary recreation. But again, he came in then, and then he was king of Persia from 559 to 530, so at the end of Daniel's life. But he was known as Cyrus the Great, but he was important. He was a pagan king, but God used him to bring the Israelites back. So again, God had said to the Israelites, "You're going into exile because of what you've done. Now, I'm going to bring you back as well." And he moved in the heart of a pagan king to do that. So a couple of other things then. There's two empires in Daniel. One was the Babylonian Empire, and then one was sort of the Median Empire. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how wide they sort of went, these are sophisticated places. And this is why we're just saying this, because Daniel lived in a sophisticated world. It's like ours in many ways. And so how he lived has complete relevance to how we can live as well. So basically, Babylon was the dominant city of its time. It was like, it was Rome in the 1st century, London in the 19th, New York in the 20th century. It really was the most happening place. And if I can work out with the wee light, I think that's the wee light. You can see up here, this sort of covers all down, this is Egypt here, down this side, and up into the Middle East, and sort of covers bits of Saudi Arabia, and then goes on across up around. You've got Israel up here, and you've Syria, and you've Iraq and Iran down here. So it was sizable. It was definitely a sizable place. But it was the most happening, most cosmopolitan place in the world at that time. But it was also brutal. It was godless, it was arrogant, and the word of the king was life or death. And conquest and power was the central theme. Never really understood that. What do you actually achieve? I don't really get it, but conquest and power was just so much part of what they did. The Median Empire that came in after was much, much bigger than that again, and shoots out a way out, really out to almost as far as little bits and pieces of China here. It goes down as far as India, so this would be Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and all around these bits and pieces, and I can't remember the other more countries around there, but you get the idea. That was an even bigger empire that was there. Few pictures now, not photographs again, reconstructions, but to give you a bit of an idea of the context in which Daniel was living, and then the context in which all the preaching that I suppose we do later on comes. So that's sort of generally a sort of reconstruction of what they believe that the palace and other buildings, as the main palace in the centre area and the other buildings around it, looked like in Babylon. That is broadly what they think some of the streets would have looked like. They always say that money doesn't buy taste, but they reckon that there was an awful lot of very godly painted buildings and things like that there. So there was a real interest in the arts. I'm not saying they were very good at it, but you can get the idea there that it was a glorious cosmopolitan sort of happening place. And one of the interesting, we've all heard about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They believe they existed. There's quite a lot written about them. They're not exactly sure where they were, but there's two places. They either reckon they were in Babylon or Nineveh, but the most of them conclude it's in Babylon. But they do say that basically this was built by Nebuchadnezzar because his wife was homesick. He brought his wife from a mountain region and came to the plains, and she was utterly homesick. So that's the kind of theory. But that was also one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And here's something for you as well. It had all these. It was 3 or 4 or 5 stories high, and it had all sorts of water and all flowing down from it. And how did the water get up there? That people stand all day pumping it up. That was their job. That was all they did, pumping the water up. And it gives you a bit of an idea. Some people's lives, as far as the king was concerned, were pretty worthless. Well, as long as you pump water for me, that's good, and that's your life. 45 years and no pension. So it's quite an interesting one. So, question for us then is why really are we studying the book of Daniel? Number one, it's well known, but actually a lot of it's not that well understood. Secondly, it's got loads of application for us in today's society. It is a history book, but it's a book of prophecy. And we see prophecies being fulfilled. And see, whenever you see prophecy being fulfilled, you know that what God says about what is still to come can be trusted. And that's why it's so important. It tells us what happened, and it hints at what is to come. And it guides us on how to live now and encourages for the future. And the topics that are in it are this here. Down the left are just sort of the day-to-day ones, like more relating to us. Disobedience and obedience is a big theme. Prayer is a massive theme. Patience, waiting for God and not rushing ahead. This was an 80-year time period. Hope. We're away from home, but we know God has said we're going back. Service, really, really big one. Whatever Daniel did, he did well. But then there's a lot of clear messages about God there too. God's sovereignty over the nations. Israel disobeyed. Israel are taken away. The Babylonians take them, but the Babylonian empire comes to an end as well. And then the Medo-Persian Empire rises. And they're rising and falling, and all this political, and God is still there. God is still the sovereign. The other thing is the personal nature of God. So you've got that geopolitical, the huge thing. The next bit is God's personal. So he's dealing with all these big things, and yet he loves Daniel. Daniel is spoken to as the esteemed one. Daniel, who is highly esteemed. Imagine being called esteemed by God. And there was that personal relationship with God, and that personal nature of God. God's trustworthiness is a massive theme. God's love, God's faithfulness, God's character as a whole. And the last one there that comes out time and time again is the naturalness of the supernatural. Daniel isn't particularly surprised when God interprets the dream. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't come out apparently stunned after the fiery furnace. They just, yep, God did it. But other people are stunned. But those that are living in a relationship with God are not stunned by that. couple of other things that then come out. So Daniel's life is marked not by dramatic events. We think it's all excitement and fun and all the rest of it. And a lot of it wasn't. A lot of his life really was marked by a quiet, consistent godliness, faithful prayer 3 times a day and many other times as well, faithful reading of the scriptures, faithful service to God and his employers. There was repentance, there was humility in his life, there was just service, and always pointing to God's character. He never took glory for what God had done. Really important. And what he did well. Didn't matter if it was for God or if it was apparently for the king. He did it with integrity, trustworthiness, and nobody could point a finger at him, which is why he ended up in the lion's den, by the way. They couldn't find any other way other than by challenging him about his God. Everything he did was underpinned by that relationship with God. And this is something we want as a church. We're planning to go forward. We want to go forward as a church. We can do nothing without an intimate relationship with God. And we really need to look at Daniel and understand what he did and how he did that faithfulness. Daniel lived in the power of the supernatural. And here's the thing here. Everything depends on a relationship with our God and Father, the living God. And we need to live in the power of the supernatural. Now, we are coming to the end, but there's a couple of thoughts I want to sort of throw at you. Now, this is, you probably won't be able to see that or not, but a lot of people in this society are so skeptical of the supernatural. Miracles can't happen. This can't happen. That can't happen, and all the rest of it. And I want to take this back just very quickly to I said this to the men yesterday actually, but to brief beginnings. So, I'm rational. Can't believe in a God. Can't believe miracles. Can't do this. Well, let's work this out. So rationalists either believe that there was nothing there at the very start and then it exploded and here we are, which doesn't seem terribly rational to me. They possibly might also believe that actually just everything was always there and it's all come together and it's nice and ordered now, but that's completely contrary to the provable laws of science. Everything's descends towards chaos. So that belief isn't particularly rational either. And then we get to the point that there was a God who created. And actually, that isn't terribly, we find that hard to understand as well. That isn't terribly rational either. So we're left with a series of non-rational options. So what makes most sense in your experience and mine? And to me, it comes down every time there is a God. There's a personal God. It explains sin. It explains beauty. It explains creation. It explains how we live. And I'm just amazed every time we look around and we just see God in so many things. But here's the point. Having concluded that from our perspective, none of those things are necessarily rational, we can then move on and actually then conclude, well, whenever we see that nothing's rational and actually there is a God, and we've concluded that there is a God, even though we can't understand it, all bets are off. If there is a God, why is a miracle something you'd be scared? Why is a miracle not possible if God is there? Why is spiritual power and moving not possible if God is there? So what I'm sort of saying is people criticize all these things and don't think it through. And the point is this here, if there is a God, and we all in this room firmly believe there is, and we have a personal relationship with him, all bets are off. We can use the power of the supernatural. We can pray for things. We can see miracles. We can ask God to do things that we cannot do ourselves. And that's what Daniel did. That's one of the most powerful messages of Daniel, full stop. So, a couple of reminders, just as we sort of come to an end. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask the band to come up after this, and then we're going to move into a bit of ministry time after that as well. Really sort of focusing on that relationship with God and the use of the power of the supernatural. But as we look throughout Daniel, we see, number one, that God is in control of the personal and the geopolitical. He's in control of the nations, the empires, and he's in control of what is happening around you and me as well. Something that Ruth said last week that I really took on board, healthy habits are vital for day-to-day life. What were Daniel's healthy habits? Formal prayer 3 times a day. I'm sure he prayed many other times. Study of the scriptures. Integrity. Left foot, right foot, right foot. Just walking in what God gave him to do. Another one was that God answers prayer. And one of the really interesting things in Daniel 10, I think it is that when Daniel's in front of God, repenting for what his people did and praying that God would intervene to bring them back, there's an angel comes, so he fasts and prays for 21 days, and an angel arrives on day 21 and says, I was sent on day 1 to come and minister to you, but it's taken me 21 days to fight the Prince of Persia. In other words, Satan and his angels were fighting, so there was a spiritual battle going on. God answered on day 1, but actually there was something going on that Daniel never saw and we never see. There's a spiritual battle going on as well. And that's back to the point, if there is a God, which we believe there is very clearly, and there are demons and there are angels and there's so much going on that we don't see, we need to remember that prayer is powerful because we appeal to the living God who, as it were, intervenes for us. But there is a spiritual battle, and it's really important to remember that. The next one is to live bravely. That was again one of the messages from last week as well. Daniel and his friends lived bravely. Several times their lives were on the line. Why? Because they obeyed God. And I come back to the point, if there is a God who does miracles and supports us and gives us a tasks in life, why do we live in fear at times? Because we have the powerful, the all-powerful God behind us, guiding, leading, and empowering. And again, we need the relationship with Him. And that's the message again. We've entitled the whole series, The Supernatural is Natural. And the challenge for us is to embrace that. And we embrace it by getting close to God, by listening to His prompts, by praying, and by acting whenever He lays things on us to do. So that's sort of the whole background to Daniel. We hope over the next bit you're going to be quite excited by a lot of the things that come along, and you see and you learn, and there'll be individual points that strike you. But please remember this, the supernatural is natural. Let's live in the power of it.
Thanks for listening to this message. For more information on what's happening in the life of our church, visit vineyarddungannon.co.uk.